All the service personnel of this country who have lost their lives have been injured during this conflict, and I know there is no constituency that hasn't been touched, none more so than the two tragic serving personnel from Chorley who lost their lives. We all have reason to be here. I wish to remind the House that the provisions which allow for the hybrid participation in the Chamber are no longer in place. All contributions to proceedings will once again be made from within this Chamber. I remind members that if they participate in the debate, they should be present throughout most, if not all, of that debate, and certainly at least for the opening speeches and two speeches following their contribution, and be here for the wind-up speeches. If the House divides today, members should enter both lobbies from the members' lobby end of the Chamber. Doorkeepers will be on hand to assist members participating in the division. I will instruct the doors to be locked 10 minutes after the start of the division. I'd also like to say thank you to all the staff of the House that's made today possible for giving up their time, breaking their holidays to ensure that this important debate goes ahead. We now come to motion number 1 relating to the sittings of the House. A Minister to move.
Beg to move.
Beg to move. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 2 on business of the House. I wish to inform the House that I have selected a manuscript amendment to this motion. The amendment is in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden and the Honourable Member for Wellingborough, and is as follows. At line 3, leave out 2:30 and insert 5 p.m. I call the Minister to move the motion.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to move the motion and to inform the House Her Majesty's Government is willing to accept the manuscript amendment in the name of my honourable and right honourable friends.
We're completely in line with Thursday's sittings. I thank the Leader of the House for that. I think that's important. So the original question that the House today, the question is that the amendment has been accepted. I think we can all agree on that. Do you need to speak? We're all happy. That's great. I want to get on with the debate. So there we are. Right, we've accepted that. We now come to motion number 3 in the name of the Prime Minister. I will call the Prime Minister to move the motion. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move, and may I begin by thanking you and all the parliamentary staff for enabling us to meet this morning. Before I turn to today's debate, I'm sure the House will want to join you, Mr. Speaker, and me in sending our condolences to the family and friends of those killed in the appalling shooting in Plymouth last week. Investigations are, of course, continuing, but we will learn every possible lesson from this tragedy. Mr. Speaker, I know that members across the House share my concern about the situation in Afghanistan, the issues it raises for our own security, and the fears of many remaining in that country, especially women and children. The sacrifice in Afghanistan is seared into our national consciousness, with 150,000 people serving there from across the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, including a number of members on all sides of the House whose voices will be particularly important today. And so it's absolutely right that we should come together for this debate. And, Mr. Speaker, yes, I will certainly give way to my right honourable friend.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. As someone who opposed this nation-building intervention, it now brings its responsibilities. In addition to getting our nationals out safely and in offering a generous welcome to the many refugees, will the Prime Minister assure me that all necessary resources are given to those Afghans and others who have helped the British Council in its work, including the promotion of women's rights, because many are in fear of their lives of retribution from the Taliban? The Arab scheme is slow-moving at the moment. Will he commit the necessary resource? Because the window of opportunity is narrow and no one must be left behind.
Got the point. Can I just remind people, if you are going to intervene, they've got to be short. If you intervene more than twice, you'll understand why you've gone down the list if there was one. Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend. I can assure him that I will, and as I will be saying in just a few moments, we will be supporting, doing everything we can to support those who have helped the UK mission in Afghanistan and investing everything that we can to support the wider area around Afghanistan and to do everything we can to avert a humanitarian crisis. Mr. Speaker, it's almost 20 years since the United States suffered the most catastrophic attack on its people since the Second World War, in which 67 British citizens also lost their lives at the hands of murderous terrorist groups incubated in Afghanistan. In response, NATO invoked Article 5 of its treaty for the first and only time in its history. And the United Kingdom, amongst others, joined America in going into Afghanistan on a mission to extirpate al-Qaeda in that country and to do whatever we could to stabilize Afghanistan in spite of all the difficulties and challenges we knew that we would face. And we succeeded in that core mission. And yes, I will give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, but would he agree that we are actually ceding back the country to the very insurgency that we went in to defeat in the first place? And the reputation of the West to support democracies across the world has suffered. There are so many lessons to be learned from what happened over the last 20 years. Will he now agree to an independent, formal inquiry into the conduct in Afghanistan?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in the House just a few weeks ago, there was an extensive defence review about the Afghan mission after the combat mission ended in 2014, and I believe that most of the key questions have already been extensively gone into. And it's important, Mr. Speaker, that we in this House should today be able to scrutinise events as they unfold. As I was saying, Mr. Speaker, we succeeded in that core mission, and the training camps in the mountain ranges of Afghanistan were destroyed. Al-Qaeda plots against this country were foiled because our serving men and women were there. And no successful terrorist attacks against the West have been mounted from Afghan soil for 2 decades. Happily give way to my right honourable friend.
Prime Minister, can I just take him back to his remarks in the House of July the 8th when he referred to the assessment that he'd made? There's clearly been a catastrophic failure of our intelligence or our assessment of the intelligence because of the speed that this has caught us unawares. Can the Prime Minister set out for the House how we may assure ourselves that in future years we can make sure there are no future terrorist attacks put together in Afghanistan that take place here in the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, I think it would be fair to say that the events in Afghanistan have unfolded and the collapse has been faster than I think even the Taliban themselves predicted. What is not true is to say that the UK government was unprepared or did not foresee this, because it was certainly part of our planning, pitting the very difficult logistical operation for the withdrawal of UK nationals has been under preparation for many months, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell the House that the decision to commission the emergency handling centre at the airport, the commissioning of that centre, took place 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker. So, if I can just make a little bit more progress, Mr. Speaker. If I just a little bit, I will certainly give way in a moment. Alongside this core mission, we worked for a better future for the people of Afghanistan, and the heroism and tireless work of our armed forces contributed to national elections, as well as the promotion and protection of human rights and equalities in a way that many in Afghanistan had not previously known. Whereas 20 years ago almost no girls went to school and women were banned from positions of governance, now 3.6 million girls have been in school this year alone, and women hold over a quarter of the seats in the Afghan Parliament. But Mr. Speaker, we must be honest and accept that huge difficulties were encountered at each turn, and some of this progress is fragile. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to our ambassador and the diplomatic team in Kabul and our armed forces on the ground who have been evacuating people in extraordinary circumstances. But one of the consequences of the rapidity of the collapse of Kabul is that many people have been left trapped, unable to access the airport, unable to evacuate, including many of those who should be coming to this country, who served us bravely in that country, and many women who are particularly at risk. Many of us across this House will have experienced chaos in the last 24, 48 hours in communicating information through to the ground to get some of those people out of the country. So can the Prime Minister give us some assurances about how we can get that information through so that we can get those brave people out of there, including many at risk of their lives right now in Kabul?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman raises exactly the right question. I spoke this morning to Ambassador Salori Bristow as well as to Brigadier Dan Blanchford, who's handling the evacuation. And it'd be fair to say the situation has stabilised since the weekend, but it remains precarious, and the UK officials on the ground are doing everything that they can to expedite the movement of people, those that need to come out, whether from the Arab scheme or the eligible persons, to get from Kabul to the airport. And at the moment, it would be fair to say that the Taliban are allowing that evacuation to go ahead. But the most important thing, Mr. Speaker, is that we get this done in as expeditious a fashion as we can, and that's what we are doing. And I may say that I'm grateful not just to the UK forces who are now out there helping to stabilise the airport, but also to the US forces as well. If I could just make some progress, Mr. Speaker. The combat phase of our mission ended in 2014, when we brought the vast majority of our troops home and handed over responsibility for security to the Afghans themselves, and we continued to support their efforts. Even at that stage, we should remember that conflict was continuous and that in spite of the bravery and sacrifice of the Afghan army, and we should never forget that 69,000 of those Afghan army troops have given their lives in this conflict, significant parts of the country remain contested or under Taliban control. And so when after 2 decades the Americans prepared to take their long-predicted and well-trailed step of a final extraction of their forces, we looked at many options, Mr. Speaker, including the potential for staying longer ourselves, finding new partners, or even increasing our presence. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. Will you share with the House what assessment UK intelligence services made of the relative fighting capacity currently of the Afghan army and the Taliban? And will you tell us what representations the UK government made to our US allies with regard to their timetable for withdrawal from Afghanistan?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I think that when he asks for a commentary on the respective military potential power of the Taliban and the Afghan forces, it's pretty clear from what has happened that the collapse of the Afghan forces has been much faster than expected. And as for our NATO allies and allies around the world, when it came for us to look at the options that this country might have in view of the American decision to withdraw, Mr. Speaker, we came up against this hard reality that since 2009, America has deployed 98% of all weapons released from NATO aircraft in Afghanistan. And at the peak of the operation, when there were 132,000 troops on the ground, 90,000 of them, Mr. Speaker, were American. The West could not continue this US-led mission, a mission conceived and executed in support and defense of America, without American logistics, without US air power, and without American might. And I do not believe... I give way with pleasure.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. I note the point that he's making about the importance of American support for our efforts in Afghanistan and those of our allies. But will he please set out when he first spoke personally to Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary-General of NATO, to discuss with him the possibility of putting together an alliance of other forces in order to replace the American support in Afghanistan?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I spoke to Secretary-General Stoltenberg the other day about NATO's continuing role in Afghanistan. but I really think that it is an illusion to believe that there is appetite amongst any of our partners for a continued military presence or for a military solution imposed by NATO in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker. That idea ended with the combat mission in 2014, and I do not believe that today, I do not believe that deploying tens of thousands of British troops to fight the Taliban is an option that, no matter how sincerely people may advocate it, and I appreciate their sincerity, but I do not believe that that is an option that would commend itself either to the British people or, Mr. Speaker, to this House. Mr. Speaker, we must deal with the position as it now is, accepting what we have achieved and what we have not achieved. And I will give way to the Right Honourable Lady.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. He seemed to be making an argument earlier that he had anticipated something similar to what went on by having the rapid response force ready and waiting. Why then was he and the Foreign Secretary both on their holidays when this catastrophe happened?
Mr. Speaker, the government has been working round the clock to deal with the unfolding situation, and we must deal with the world as it is, accepting what we have achieved and what we have not achieved. And the UK will work with our international partners on a shared plan to support the people of Afghanistan and to contribute to regional stability. There will be 5 parts, Mr. Speaker, to this approach. First, our immediate focus, in just a minute, our immediate focus must be on helping those to whom we have direct obligations by evacuating UK nationals together with those Afghans who have assisted our efforts over the past 20 years. And I know the whole House will join me in paying tribute to the bravery and commitment of our Ambassador, Sir Laurie Bristow. I give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for giving way on that particular point. He will be aware that there are 228 missionaries in Afghanistan currently under sentence of death. Those missionaries need to be taken out of Afghanistan. Of course, there are tens of thousands of others who are under sentence of death and fear for their life. Will the Prime Minister assure the House that every effort will be made to bring back to safe haven people whose lives are under threat as a result of the catastrophe and foreign policy episode that has gone on in that country?
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for raising the very needy case that he does, and I'm sure that colleagues across the House, literally every member, would I imagine, has received messages from people who know someone who needs to get out of Afghanistan. And I can tell the Right Honourable Gentleman that we are doing everything we can to help out of that country those people to whom we owe, Mr. Speaker, a debt of obligation. And on that point, I want to repeat my thanks, not just to Laurie Bristow, but also to the Commander on the ground, Brigadier Dan Blanchford, and the entire British team in Kabul. I can tell the House that we have so far, I'm going to make some progress, Mr. Speaker, we have so far secured the safe return of 306 UK nationals and 2,052 Afghan nationals as part of our resettlement programme, with a further 2,000 Afghan applications completed and many more being processed. UK officials are working round the clock to keep the exit door open in the most difficult circumstances and actively seeking those we believe are eligible but as yet unregistered. And I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank him for giving way. Can you explain then how many people he think are still eligible for relocation and have still to sign up? And he says they're doing everything they can to get these people out. So what does everything they can mean? How are they identifying these people, where they are, especially if they're already in hiding in fear of their lives?
That's why, Mr. Speaker, it's been so important that we maintain a presence at Kabul airport, and that's why we've been getting the message out that we want people to come through. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, earlier on, it is important for everybody to understand that at the moment in the days that we have ahead of us, which may be short, but at the moment this is an environment in which the Taliban are permitting this evacuation to take place. Mr. Speaker, these are interpreters, they are locally engaged staff and others who have risked their lives supporting our military efforts and seeking to secure new freedoms for their country. We are proud to bring these brave Afghans to our shores, and we continue to appeal for more to come forward. And I give way with pleasure.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister. The Home Secretary announced this morning that the UK will be taking 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan, but that only 5,000 will be able to come this year. What are the 15,000 meant to do? Hang around and wait until they've been executed?
Yeah, exactly.
Mr. Speaker, that's the 5,000 on whom we're spending 200 million to bring a further 5,000 on top of the, I think it will be 10,000 altogether that we bring in under the ARAP and other programmes. We will be increasing that number over the coming years to, as I said, to 20,000. But the bulk of the effort of this country will be directed and should be directed, Mr. Speaker, to supporting people in Afghanistan and in the region, Mr. Speaker, in order to prevent a worse humanitarian crisis. And I believe, and may I tell the House that in that conviction, I am supported very strongly both by President Macron of France and by Chancellor Merkel of Germany. We are also, Mr. Speaker, doing everything possible to accelerate the visas for the 30...
The member for Hyndburn can't be like a drone in the chamber, completely above everybody all the way through. Stand up and down, please, not just hover. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I was telling the House that we are making sure that we bring back the 35 brilliant evening scholars so that they can come and study in our great universities. We're deploying an additional 800 British troops to support this evacuation operation, and I can assure the House that we will continue this operation for as long as conditions at the airport allow, and I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as of last week, it was still Home Office policy that we would send people back to Kabul because we thought Kabul was safe. Can the Prime Minister now also confirm it's not just about people coming out of Afghanistan, it's about keeping people safe here, and we will not send people back to this nightmare?
She's entirely right. We will not be sending people back to Afghanistan, and nor, by the way, Mr. Speaker, will be allowing people to come from Afghanistan to this country in an indiscriminate way. We want to be generous, but we must make sure that we look after our own security. And over the coming weeks, we will redouble our efforts, working with others to protect the UK homeland and all our citizens and interests from any threat that may emanate from a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, from terrorism to the narcotics trade. And I give way to my honourable friend,
Mr. Forgiving-Way, does he agree with me that we have to do everything we can to support those who have supported us, like the Royal Marine Pen Farthing and his NALZ charity of veterinary staff and their immediate family who now need safe passage back to the UK?
Mr. Speaker, I think, like many of us, I have been extensively lobbied on behalf of the excellent work done by Mr. Pen Farthing. I'm well aware of his cause, all the wonderful things that he has done. And for animals in Afghanistan, I can tell my honourable friend that we will do everything we can to help Mr. Pen Farthing and others who face particular difficulty like himself. And, but as I say, without in any way jeopardising our own national security. These are concerns shared across the international community, from the region itself to all the NATO alliance and indeed all 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And I will chair a virtual meeting of the G7 in the coming days. Third, Mr. Speaker, we also have, in a minute, we also have an enduring commitment to all the Afghan people, and now, more than ever, we must reaffirm that commitment. Our efforts must be focused on supporting the Afghan people in the region itself, particularly those fleeing conflict or the threat of violence. We therefore call on the United Nations to lead a new humanitarian effort in this region. And I give way to the Right Honourable Lady Opposite.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way, and I welcome his commitment to support in the region and also the government's commitment to a resettlement programme. But could he confirm the Home Secretary announced in 2019 that the UK would continue a resettlement scheme of 5,000 refugees a year after the Syrian scheme closed? Could he confirm that the announcement today of an Afghan resettlement scheme is in addition to that existing 5,000 resettlement commitment, as opposed to simply being a refocusing or a displacement of that existing 5,000 a year resettlement programme?
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady Opposite, because I think she's asked a question that formed itself in many people's minds about the 5,000. And yes, indeed, the 5,000 that extra in the resettlement scheme are additional to those already announced. And we will support those people in coming to this country. We will also support the wider international community in delivering on humanitarian projects in the region by doubling, Mr. Speaker, the amount of humanitarian and development assistance that we had previously committed to Afghanistan this year, with new funding, wait for it, Mr. Speaker, taking this up to £286 million with immediate effect. And we call on others, £286 million with immediate effect, and we call on others to work together on a shared humanitarian effort, focusing on helping the most vulnerable in what will be formidably difficult circumstances. And I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister, and he's being very generous with his time. Over the past 20 years, there have been some 50 NATO and partner nations that have been involved in Afghanistan. I welcome the measures that have been proposed by the UK and other countries such as the US, Canada, France, Germany, and so on. However, there are many countries still who have been involved in Afghanistan in recent years who have still yet to come to the plate and to recognise their responsibility in helping these people at this desperate time. Would the Prime Minister inform the House what is being done to encourage these other countries to take up their responsibility and help these people in Afghanistan?
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point, Mr. Speaker, and that's why the UK has chaired the Security Council of the UN and asked to put a motion together with our French friends to get the world to focus on the humanitarian needs of Afghanistan, and we'll be doing the same thing in NATO, in the G7 and the other bodies in which we have a leadership role. And we want all these countries to step up, as he rightly says, Mr. Speaker, and focus on the most vulnerable in what will be formidably difficult circumstances. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, I've given way, I think you'll agree, quite a lot already this morning, and I know that thanks to the generosity of yourself, Mr. Speaker, and the House, there is now ample time for debate until later on this afternoon, where I think many members will be able to get their points across. I therefore intend, Mr. Speaker, by your leave, to make some progress. Fourth, while we must focus on the region itself, we will also create safe and legal routes for those Afghans most in need to come and settle here in the UK. So in addition to those Afghans with whom we've worked directly, I can announce today that we're committing to relocating another 5,000 Afghans this year with a new and bespoke resettlement scheme focusing on the most vulnerable, particularly women and children. And we will keep this under review for future years with the potential of accommodating up to 20,000 over the long term. And so taken together, Mr. Speaker, I've been very generous with my interventions. I think you will agree already, and I've made my position clear. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, we are committing almost £500 million of humanitarian funding to support the Afghan people. Fifth, Mr. Speaker, we must also face the reality of a change of regime in Afghanistan. And as President of the G7, the UK will work to unite the international community behind a clear plan for dealing with this regime in a unified and concerted way. Over the last 3 days, I've spoken with the NATO and UN Secretaries General, with President Biden, with Chancellor Merkel, with President Macron, and Prime Minister Khan. We are clear and we have agreed that it would be a mistake for any country to recognise any new regime in Kabul prematurely or bilaterally. Instead, those countries that care about Afghanistan's future should work towards common conditions about the conduct of the new regime before deciding, together, whether to recognise it and on what terms. We will judge this regime based on the choices it makes and by its actions rather than by its words. On its attitude to terrorism, to crime and narcotics, as well as humanitarian access and the rights of girls to receive an education. Defending human rights will remain of the highest priority, and we will use every available political and diplomatic means to ensure that those human rights remain at the top of the international agenda. Mr. Speaker, our United Kingdom has a roll call of honour that bears the names of 457 servicemen and women who gave their lives in some of the world's harshest terrain, and many others who bear injuries to this day, fighting in what had become the epicentre of global terrorism. And even amid the heart-wrenching scenes we see today, I believe they should be proud of their achievements. And we should be deeply proud of them, because they conferred benefits that are lasting and ineradicable on millions of people in one of the poorest countries on earth. And they provided vital protection for 2 decades to this country and the rest of the world. They gave their all for our safety, and we owe it to them to give our all to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a breeding ground for terrorism. Because no matter how grim the lessons of the past, the future is not yet written. And at this bleak turning point, we must help the people of Afghanistan to choose the best of all their possible futures. And in the UN, the G7, in NATO, with friends and partners around the world, that is the critical task on which this government is now urgently engaged and will be engaged in the days to come.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Afghanistan. Can I suggest backbenchers will be starting with 7 minutes? And now I call on the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank you and the staff for recalling Parliament for today's debate. Before I get to the urgent issue at hand, let me join you, Mr. Speaker, and the Prime Minister in condemning the appalling shootings in Plymouth last week. We all send our condolences to the bereaved families. We must resolve to ensure that firearms do not get into the hands of dangerous people, and finally to get to grips with the way that hate thrives on the internet. Turning to Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker, it's been a disastrous week, an unfolding tragedy. 20 years ago, the Taliban were largely in control of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda were using the country as a training ground and a base for terror, including plotting the horrific 9/11 attack. There were widespread human rights abuses. Girls were denied an education. Women couldn't work. Being gay was punishable by death, all imposed without democracy. Since then, a fragile democracy emerged. Mr. Speaker, it was by no means perfect, but no international terrorist attacks have been mounted from Afghanistan in that period. Women have gained liberty and one office. Schools and clinics have been built.
and Afghans have allowed themselves to dream of a better future. Mr. Speaker, those achievements were born of sacrifice. Sacrifice by the Afghan people who bravely fought alongside their NATO allies, and British sacrifice. Over 150,000 UK personnel have served in Afghanistan, including members across this House, including the honourable and gallant members for Tunbridge and Moling, for Barnsley Central, Plymouth Moorview, Norwich South, Aldershot, the Isle of Wight, Filton and Bradley Stoke, and Wells. They and the tens of thousands of others deployed in Afghanistan served in difficult and challenging circumstances. And the Labour Party, and I'm sure everybody across this House, thanks each and every one of them, of the 150,000. Many returned with life-changing injuries. And tragically, 457 didn't return at all. I'll just make progress and then I will.
Later today, I'll be attending the service at RAF Lynham, outside Royal Bassett, to commemorate the 10th anniversary, which falls today, of the last repatriation through Bassett. Will the right honourable gentleman agree with me that the message to those people that I will see today must be not that these young lives were wasted, but that they played an absolutely essential role in deterring and destroying terrorism and carrying out so many other good works in Afghanistan?
I wholeheartedly agree with that, and will address it in just one moment. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, for many of those who return from Afghanistan and other places around the world, mental health has been an all too familiar issue raised by veterans time and again. And the events of the last few days and weeks will have exacerbated the situation, reopening old wounds, and everybody across this House will have had examples of that. So we must improve mental health services for our veterans. Mr. Speaker, in addressing the very point that's just been made, I want to address directly all those who served in Afghanistan and their families, especially the families of those who were lost. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Your sacrifice was not in vain. You brought stability, reduced the terrorist threat, and enabled progress. We are all proud of what you did. Your sacrifice deserves better than this, and so do the Afghan people. Mr. Speaker, there's been a major miscalculation of the resilience of the Afghan forces and staggering complacency from our government about the Taliban threat. The result is that the Taliban are now back in control of Afghanistan. The gains made through 20 years of sacrifice hang precariously. Women and girls fear for their liberty. Afghan civilians are holding onto the undercarriage of NATO aircraft, literally clinging to departing hope. And we face new threats to our security and an appalling humanitarian crisis. I will.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for all the reasons he mentioned. Doesn't he agree that President Biden is actually wrong when he talks about American sacrifices in a civil war? The Taliban is not at war with a regime. The Taliban is at war with the civilised values of justice, equality and tolerance that all of us hold dear, and against which it respects no international boundaries.
I would agree with that intervention and thank the honourable member for it. Mr. Speaker, I'll just make some progress and then I will, of course. Mr. Speaker, the desperate situation requires leadership and for the Prime Minister to snap out of his complacency. The most urgent task is the protection of our diplomatic staff still working heroically in Kabul and the evacuation of British nationals and Afghans who've risked their lives. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, the Labour Party fully supports the deployment of troops to this end. We want it to succeed just as quickly and safely as possible. The Defence Secretary has said that some people who've worked with us will not get back. Unconscionable. the government, in one moment I will, the government must outline a plan to work with our allies to do everything that's possible to ensure that does not happen. Guarantee that our troops have the resources they need to carry out their mission effectively and as safely as possible, and work to provide stable security at the airport in Kabul so that flights can depart and visas can be processed. We all know how difficult that is. We all know how hard everybody is working on the ground, and we fully support it. And I raise an issue not by way of criticism, but just to get some reassurance, because there are reports this morning from NGOs that an evacuation plane left almost empty this morning because evacuees couldn't get to the airport to get to that plane. As I say, we are not challenging the work on the ground. We know how difficult it is, but at some appropriate moment I would like to see that addressed. If true. I will, yes.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Can I just bring him back to the statement by the President of the United States the other day? Does he not agree with me that this took on the terms, really, of a sort of shameful excuse? When he blames the Afghan armed forces, who have lost nearly 70,000 in trying to defend Afghan, when corruption had stripped away much of their pay, their money, their support, and the American decision to withdraw the aircraft cover was almost certainly going to lead us, does he not think that that is shameful?
Mr. Speaker, the US is, of course, an important ally, but to overlook the fighting of the Afghan troops and forces in recent years, they have been at the forefront of that fighting, I think is wrong for any of us to overlook all the situation that they now find themselves in. Mr. Speaker, the urgent task is, of course, the evacuation. Equally urgent is the immediate refugee crisis. I'll just make some progress and then I will. Many Afghans have bravely sought to rebuild their country. They did so on a promise of democratic freedoms, the rule of law, and liberty for the oppressed, including women and girls. They are our friends, and that was our promise. They are now fearing for their lives. We do not turn our backs on friends at their time of need. We owe an obligation to the people of Afghanistan. There should be a resettlement scheme for people to rebuild their lives here. Safe and legal routes. It must be a resettlement scheme that meets the scale of the enormous challenge. But what the government has announced this morning does not do that. It is vague. It will support just 5,000 in the first year, a number without rationale. Was that based on a risk assessment of those most at need, or was it plucked out of the air? Others, the offer to others in one moment, the offer to others is in the long term, But for those desperately needing our help now, there is no long term, Mr. Speaker. Just day-to-day survival. Yet again, this government... I will give way.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, as well as the need for a much more bold and ambitious resettlement programme. Would he agree with me that this disaster must mark a turning point for our failed asylum system, in particular getting rid of the so-called hostile environment and the Nationality and Borders Bill, under which a woman fleeing the Taliban with her children on a boat across the Channel would be criminalised? Does he agree that that bill must now be revised?
Thank you for that intervention. I'm going to come on to the specifics of the system, because yet again this government seems ill-prepared and unwilling, just as it has been too slow to provide sanctuary to Afghans who've served alongside Britain. Too many reports of eligible Afghans facing bureaucratic hurdles and too many unfairly excluded. Mr. Speaker, knowing the date of withdrawal was coming for months, the Home Office is not close to completing the process they've already got up and running. It was designed to help 7,000 people, yet Home Office figures this week showed only 2,000 have been helped so far. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and the point that I wanted to make indeed to the Prime Minister was the situation facing Afghan Sikhs. Now, I know from my own constituency casework that there are Afghan Sikhs in the system at the moment waiting for clearance from the Home Office. So one of the things I would like to call on the government to do is to process those as quickly as possible and not leave all those people in the system waiting any longer than they have to at the moment. They are terrified with the idea of being sent back home, and despite the reassurance given to my honourable friend, I do not see any movement from the Home Office to give these people the legal status that they need.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and there have been other examples across the House of individuals and groups who are very obviously at risk in Afghanistan and need to come out just as quickly as possible. And that's, Mr. Speaker, where the question arises to what's behind the 5,000 number and why the others are having to wait so long. Mr. Speaker, the scale of the refugee crisis requires an international response, but we must lead it, and lead with a resettlement programme that meets the scale of the challenge. The scheme must be generous and welcoming. If it's not, we know the consequences. We know the consequences now. Violent reprisals in Afghanistan, people tragically fleeing into the arms of human traffickers. We know this is what will happen. More people risking and losing their lives on unsafe journeys, including across the English Channel. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead. I will.
For him giving way. He speaks of people fleeing, but what we have yet to assess is whether anyone outside of Kabul is able to get to somewhere of safety. Does he agree that now a safe corridor needs to be opened to an international border so that those who are not near Kabul can also get to safety via third countries?
Well, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that intervention. And there is huge concern, as all members will know, about our line of sight beyond Kabul just at the moment. And again, that calls into question where the 5,000 number comes from, because we're not even in a position to assess at the moment the position outside of Kabul. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead. Mr. Speaker, I will.
The government of this kingdom to be overthrown by a wicked and brutal regime. I venture that he would want a leading role in the resistance. He wouldn't be queuing at the airport, would he?
When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I had some of my prosecutors in Afghanistan at huge risk working on counter-terrorism with other brave souls there. So I won't take that from him or anybody else. Mr. Speaker, once these immediate challenges are addressed, we face an uncertain and difficult future. The Taliban are back in control, and we cannot be naive about the consequences. We've lost our primary source of leverage in political discussions, and everything we've achieved in the last 20 years is now under threat. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will give way. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right to say that we cannot allow Afghanistan to become a training ground for violent hate and terrorism. But that will be more difficult now that Afghanistan has descended into chaos. But if preventing al-Qaeda camps is now the limit of our ambition, we are betraying 20 years of sacrifice by our armed forces, and we're betraying the Afghan people who cannot be left to the cruelty of the Taliban. I will.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He speaks about the lack of ambition and the lack of urgency, which of course summarises everything about this government's approach to this crisis and many others. Isn't it telling about the whole approach of this government that when we had an Afghan government that we wanted to support, they should cut the amount of overseas aid we sent, and now the Taliban are in charge, they're talking about increasing the amount of overseas aid?
I'm grateful for that intervention. I'm going to come to the question of aid in just a minute, because it's a very important point in this context, looking at what has happened in recent weeks and months. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will make way. So we have to use every tool that remains at our disposal to protect human rights in Afghanistan. The government is right not to recognise the Taliban as the official government, and the Prime Minister's made that clear. But this must be part of a wider strategy developed with our UN security partners, our NATO allies, to apply pressure to the Taliban, not only to stamp out a resurgence of terror groups, but to retain the liberties and human rights of Afghans. We must work with Afghans' neighbours to ensure there is consistent pressure, and there must be a UN-backed plan to ensure our aid budget is used to support humanitarian causes in Afghanistan, not fund the Taliban. Mr. Speaker, this is a difficult task with no guarantee of success. So it should concern us all that the Prime Minister's judgment on Afghanistan has been appalling. Mr. Speaker, nobody believes that Britain and our allies could have remained in Afghanistan indefinitely, or that Britain could have fought alone. NATO leaders were put in a difficult position after President Trump agreed with the Taliban that all US forces would withdraw by May 2021. But, Mr. Speaker, that agreement was made in February 2020, 18 months ago. We've had 18 months to prepare and plan for the consequences of what followed, to plan and to prepare for the resettlement of refugees and those that have supported us, for supporting the Afghan government in managing the withdrawal, for securing international and regional pressure on the Taliban and support for the Afghan government. The very problems we're confronting today in this debate were all known problems for the last 18 months, and there's been a failure of preparation. Mr. Speaker, the lack of planning is unforgivable, and the Prime Minister bears a heavy responsibility. Mr. Speaker, he mutters today. He was in a position to lead, but he didn't. Britain holds a seat at the United Nations Security Council. We're a key player within NATO. We're chair of the G7. Every one of these platforms could and should have been used to prepare for the withdrawal of forces, to rally international support behind a plan to stabilise Afghanistan through the process and keep us safe. I will give way in just a minute. But what did Mr. Speaker, did the Prime Minister use those platforms in those 18 months to prepare? No, he didn't. What did he do? What did he do instead? We debated this. He cut the development budget. He cut the development budget that was key to the strength and resilience of democracy in Afghanistan. He's making a great deal today of the money he's putting in. £292 million was spent in Afghanistan in 2019. In 2021, £155 million. Short-sighted, small-minded, and a threat to security. I will in a moment. I'm going to make this list. He failed to visit Afghanistan as Prime Minister, meaning that his last trip as Foreign Secretary in 2018 was not to learn or to push British interests, but to avoid a vote on Heathrow. Hundreds of thousands of British people have flown to Afghanistan to serve. The Prime Minister flew to avoid public service. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on. In March this year, the Prime Minister published an integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy. Huge review. He boasted that the review would, in his words, demonstrate to our allies in Europe and beyond that they can always count on the UK when it really matters. Well, the Afghan government was an ally, yet in the integrated review there were just 2 passing references to Afghanistan. 2 passing references. Mr. Speaker, the review didn't even mention the Taliban. It didn't even mention the Taliban. It didn't mention NATO withdrawal or the consequences of the Doha Agreement. It did cut the size of the army, and we did criticise it at the time. The very force that we're now relying on, eye off the ball, astonishingly careless.
You were probably on holiday at the time.
The question is, why was the Prime Minister so careless? Why did he fail to lead? Mr. Speaker, it comes down to complacency and poor judgment. There was a calculation. I will in a moment, I'm going to make this case. There was a calculation that withdrawal would lead to military stalemate in Afghanistan and that stalemate would accelerate political discussions. Seeing this in July, members on both sides of this House warned the government, read Hansard, that they may be underestimating the threat of the Taliban. On both sides of the House, that point was made. That was ignored. And the government's preparation for withdrawal were based on a miscalculation of the resilience of the Afghan forces and a staggering complacency about the Taliban threat. The Prime Minister is as guilty as anyone. This Sunday, he said this, and I quote, "We've known for a long time that this was the way things were going." That's what he said on Sunday. That's not what he told this House. That's not what he told this House. In July, the Prime Minister stood there and assured members that there is no military path to victory for the Taliban. And then he went on to say, Mr. Speaker, "I do not think that the Taliban are capable of victory by military means." The British government were wrong and complacent, the Prime Minister was wrong and complacent, and when he wasn't rewriting history, the Prime Minister was displaying the same appalling judgment and complacency last week. Mr. Speaker, the response of the British ambassador to the Taliban arriving at the gates of Kabul was to personally process the paperwork for those that needed to flee. He is still there, and we thank him and his staff. The Prime Minister's response to the Taliban arriving at the gates of Kabul was to go on holiday. No sense of the gravity of the situation, not leadership to drive international efforts on the evacuation. The Foreign Secretary shakes his head. Mr. Speaker, what would I do differently? I wouldn't stay on holiday whilst Kabul was falling. And there are numerous examples of those leaders on both sides of the House who've come back immediately in a time of crisis. The Foreign Secretary stayed on his... He's shouting now. He's shouting now. Silent. Mr.
Order. The Prime Minister was heard, and I want to hear the Leader of the Opposition. I don't want people to shout, you may disagree, but you'll also may wish to catch my eye. Don't ruin that chance. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary shouts now, but he stayed on holiday while our mission in Afghanistan was disintegrating. Mr. Speaker, he didn't even speak to ambassadors in the region as Kabul fell to the Taliban. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. You cannot coordinate an international response from the beach. A dereliction of duty by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, a government totally unprepared for the scenario that it had 18 months to prepare for. Mr. Speaker, it's one thing for people to lose trust in the Prime Minister at home, but when the trust in the word of our Prime Minister is questioned abroad, there are serious consequences for our safety and security at home. Mr. Speaker, in one moment, recent events in Afghanistan shame the West. Not just the scenes of chaos, but what it says about our abandonment of the Afghan people. For those brave people around the world, living under regimes paying scant regard to human rights, but resisting those regimes in pursuit of democracy, equality and individual freedom. What does this say to them? What does this retreat from freedom signal to those prepared to stand up for it? What does this surrender to extremism mean for those prepared to face it down? And what does it mean for those nations who support an international rules-based system when we hand over power to those who recognise no rules at all. That is the challenge of our time. Mr. Speaker, the British and Afghan people will have to live with the consequences of the Prime Minister's failure. We have fought for 20 years to rid Afghanistan of terror, terror which threatens our security here in Britain and liberty in Afghanistan. The Taliban are back in control. The Prime Minister has no plan how to handle the situation, just as he had no plan to prevent it. What we've won through 20 years of sacrifice could all be lost. That is the cost, Mr. Speaker, of careless leadership. Thank you.
Theresa May. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the opportunity to visit Afghanistan twice, but I recognise that there are others across this House whose experience is more recent, more vivid, more practical, longer and broader than mine. But when I was there, I was struck by the commitment and dedication of our armed forces serving there and of other British personnel. All were doing what they could to give hope to the people of Afghanistan. People who, thanks to our presence, were able to enjoy freedoms they had been denied under the Taliban. 20 years on, 457 British military personnel have died in Afghanistan, and many more have suffered life-changing injuries. Yes, many girls have been educated because of British aid, but it is not just that the freedoms once enjoyed will now be taken away, but there are many, many Afghans, not just those who worked with British forces, who are now in fear of their lives. It is right that we should open up a refugee scheme, but we must make it absolutely certain that it is accessible to all those who need it. Now, of course, the NATO presence was always going to end at some point in time, but the withdrawal, when it came, was due to be orderly, planned, and on the basis of conditions. It has been none of these. What has been most shocking has been the chaos and the speed of the takeover by the Taliban. In July of this year, both President Biden and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, indicated that they did not think that the Taliban was ready or able to take over control of the country. Was our intelligence really so poor? Was our understanding of the Afghan government so weak? Was our knowledge of the position on the ground so inadequate? Or did we really believe this? Or did we just feel that we had to follow the United States and hope that on a wing and a prayer it would be all right on the night? Because the reality is, if I may just make this point, the reality is that as long as a time limit was given and dates were given for withdrawal, all the Taliban had to do was to ensure there were sufficient problems for the Afghan government not to be able to have full control of the country, and then just sit and wait.
Would my right honourable friend agree that President Biden decided unilaterally to withdraw without agreeing and negotiating a plan with either the Afghan government or the NATO allies, and that the response of the UK government in the circumstances has been fast, purposeful and extremely well guided to protecting the interests of UK citizens?
Can I just say to my right honourable friend that what President Biden has done is upheld a decision that was made by President Trump. It was a unilateral decision of President Trump to do a deal with the Taliban that has led to this withdrawal. And of course, what we've seen from the scenes in Afghanistan is that it hasn't been all right on the night. As I say, there are many in Afghanistan who fear not just that their lives will be irrevocably changed for the worse, but who fear for their lives. Numbered among them will be women. Women who embrace freedom, embrace the right to education, to work and to participate in the political process. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, was right to make the education of girls a key aim of his administration. But in Afghanistan, that will now be swept away. Those girls who have been educated will have no opportunity to use that education. The Taliban proclaim that women will be allowed to work and girls will be allowed to go to school. But this will be under Islamic law. or rather under their interpretation of Islamic law.
Am I right, Honourable
And we,
on that point?
if I may just, and we have seen before what that means for the lives of women and girls. Are you aware?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend giving way on that point. Some of the women who show most courage are the 250 women who serve as judges under the attempt that was made to impose a decent, honest legal system on Afghanistan. They are particularly feared as being targets. The Bar Council and the Law Society have asked the government to particularly take cognizance of the particular risks that they run. Will she support the court for them to be given particular priority in being brought to safety? Because they put their lives on their line for their fellow women and for their whole country.
Very important point. As has been said, there are many groups in Afghanistan who have actually put their lives on the line to support the Afghan government, to support democracy, to support justice in Afghanistan. And it is right that we should do everything that we can to support them in their time of need. But as we know, I may just make a further point about women and girls. As we know, under the Taliban regime, sadly, the life of women and girls will not be the same. They will not have the rights that we believe they should have, and they will not have the freedoms that they should have. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Okay. There are already reports from sources in Kabul that the Taliban is executing collaborators and homosexuals. Does she agree with me that complacency is absolutely misplaced? And what does she suggest should we do to protect those people who need to get out?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that the government is doing much to protect people in trying to ensure that it is possible for people to be able to access ways of leaving Afghanistan. Now, I think a point was made earlier about the issue of not just expecting people to get to Kabul, and I hope that this is something that the government will be able to look into and be able to take up. Furthermore, apart from the impact on people's lives in terms of women and girls, we do see potential humanitarian crisis, at least in some parts of Afghanistan. Now, of course, we cut our international aid budget, but I'm pleased that the Foreign Secretary has told me that more funding is going to be made available to deal with this crisis. But it isn't just about the impact of the people on Afghanistan that must concern us. We must be deeply concerned about the possible impact here in the UK. The aim of our involvement in Afghanistan was to ensure that it could not be used as a haven for terrorists. Terrorists who could train, plot and encourage attacks here in the UK. Al-Qaeda has not gone away. Daesh may have lost their ground in Syria, but these terrorist groups remain and they have spawned others. We will not defeat them until we have defeated the ideology which feeds their extremism.
Thank you, my friend, for giving way. Is she concerned? I mean, one of the most concerning things that's happening is that several thousand Al-Qaeda operatives have been freed from Bagram prison, from Kabul prison, from Kandahar. Is she concerned that these people are going to go back to their old ways, or do we hope that they're somehow going to go into retirement? Because it seems to me that we are going to restart a new round of international terrorism.
Well, my honourable friend has actually anticipated a point I was exactly about to make, which is the Taliban, of course, have said that they will not allow Afghanistan to become a haven for terrorists again. Yesterday in the press conference they said they would not allow anything to happen in Afghanistan which led to attacks elsewhere across the world. But their actions must be what we look at, not their words. And their action has, as my honourable friend has just pointed out, been to release thousands of high-value Taliban, Al-Qaeda and Daesh fighters. So their action is completely different from their words. And I think it is absolutely essential for us to recognise that the probability that Afghanistan will once again become a breeding ground for the terrorists who seek to destroy our way of life. I will...
Thank you for giving way, because she's making exactly the point I hoped to hear from the Prime Minister and didn't. The reasons that we went into Afghanistan in 2002 remain valid today. If the actions that have been taken in recent weeks render a military solution to that problem impossible, then we have to have a non-military solution. What does she see that non-military solution as being?
To the right honourable gentleman, I'm going to make a reference later on to this issue. I think that he is absolutely right, that the question of a military solution has not been there actually for some time, because our combat mission ended some years ago. But what we have been doing is trying to provide the support to enable a democratic government to actually take proper control of that country. I'd be happy to talk to the right honourable gentleman at some time about my views, that actually I think that the idea of trying to impose just a Western example of democracy, actually in a country which is geographically difficult and which relies a lot on regional government, possibly was a route that we should have reconsidered when we were going down that route. But I will not go down that road any longer, despite his temptations. But there was another...
About the time for backbencher, I did suggest it was 7 minutes. We're now heading to 10. I didn't put a time limit on, but I'm going to have to do after this.
Speaker, I'm very grateful for your generosity to me. For the UK, there was another important element of our work in Afghanistan. That was stopping the drugs from coming into the United Kingdom. Yeah. Sadly, that has not been as successful as we would have liked it to be, but we did support a drug crime-specific criminal justice system in Afghanistan. I assume that is now going to come to a complete end. So, once again, this is another area where the withdrawal is not just about Afghanistan, it has an impact on the streets of the UK. But what must also be of key concern to us is the message this sends around the world to those who would do the West harm. The message it sends about our capabilities and, most important, about our willingness to defend our values. What does it say about us as a country? What does it say about NATO if we are entirely dependent on a unilateral decision taken by the United States? Yes. We all understand the importance of American support. But despite the comments from my right honourable friend earlier, I do find it incomprehensible and worrying that the United Kingdom was not able to bring together not a military solution, but an alternative alliance of countries to continue to provide the support necessary to sustain a government in Afghanistan. Surely one outcome of this must be a reassessment of how NATO operates. NATO is the bedrock of European security, but Russia will not be blind to the implications of this withdrawal decision and the manner in which it has been taken. Neither will China and others have failed to notice the implications, because in recent years the West has appeared to be less willing to defend its values. This cannot continue, because if it does, it will embolden those who do not share those values and wish to impose their way of life on others. I'm afraid I think this has been a major setback for British foreign policy. We boast about global Britain, but where is global Britain on the streets of Kabul? A successful foreign policy strategy will be judged by our deeds, not by our words. And I finally just say this. All of our military personnel, all who served in Afghanistan, should hold their heads high and be proud of what they achieved in that country over 20 years. Of the change of life they brought to the people of Afghanistan and the safety they brought here to the UK. The politicians sent them there. The politicians decided to withdraw. The politicians must be responsible for the consequences.
Leader of the SNP,